Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Can Procurement Be Used to Effectively Regulate AI? Joined together from the GW Government Procurement Law Program in Washington, D.C., along with the University of Bristol Law School. We are delighted to welcome you today. My name is Jessica Tillipman, and I am the Assistant Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies at GW Law. Today, we will be listening to first a presentation by Professor Albert Sanchez-Graells from the University of Bristol on his research regarding AI. This is ongoing research funded by the British Academy. Then we will begin a discussion where we will be joined by Professor Aris Georgopoulos from the University of Nottingham and Scott Simpson, the Digital Transformation Lead from the Department of Homeland Security, Office of the Chief Procurement Officer. And then joined briefly after that, hopefully, is Elizabeth Liz Chirico, the Acquisition Innovation Lead at the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army Procurement. She's a little late joining us, but she will join us shortly, hopefully. And so again, we at the end of the discussion following Albert's presentation, we will open it up to questions from the audience. So at any time during the course of this presentation, please feel free to start adding questions to the Q&A function in the webinar. We can either answer them in real time or we will answer them during the discussion portion live. So again, throughout the session, as questions come to you, please feel free to put them in the Q&A or even the chat function if you'd like to do that and you prefer it. All right, without further ado, I will now turn the floor over to my colleague. Albert, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you to GW for hosting this second part of the webinar series on AI and procurement, or digital tech and procurement. I'm just gonna try to throw a few things on the table for discussion through this presentation, which I hope everybody can see now. So I guess we could cut this very short. And can procurement be used to effectively regulate AI? No, move on. No, but let's spend 10 more minutes trying to see why. As Jessica kindly mentioned, this is part of my bigger project about the interaction between digital technologies and procurement, where I look at two dimensions of it. One is about how we buy the tech, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And the other one is about how we adopt the tech in procurement, which is what we discussed in December. And there's a recording from the Twin seminar that you can access. The goal today is to provide you with an overview, maybe a bit of a provocative overview of the challenges in buying unregulated or under-regulated technologies, such as artificial intelligence, but also other digital technologies, and the policy recommendations I have come up with. I really look forward to discussing it with the fellow colleagues in the panel and with the audience, so I'll keep this very short. Also, maybe to say, it's all perhaps a little bit UK-centric. So some of these, particularly the policy recommendations, have to be taken into account in the UK context, but we can come back to that in the Q&A. I guess the starting point is that I guess if you have woken up this morning to the new open letter about how AI has existential risks for humanity and why we should stop it and regulate it, we are living in a time of loads of discussion. We have a race to AI. We have maybe also a race to regulate AI, but it's not clear where the different countries are positioning themselves. There's lots of uncertainty about what the regulation of AI is going to look 3 years down the line, even maybe 6 months down the line. ChatGPT was not a big regulatory issue 8 months ago. It's a big issue now. But what we know is that public buyers are under pressure to procure AI and to explore ways in which they can use these technologies, in particular, like always, to reduce costs, increase efficiencies. In the end, if there is a promise of doing things better, cheaper, then procurement is going to be right there, having to figure out the how. And the how is what interests me today. The common claim, so to speak, or maybe it's a very Anglo-Saxon position, is to say, let's do it through procurement. So we don't know how to regulate AI in general. Let's take a bit of a step back and let the market do its thing and innovate, but let's regulate through procurement. Let's use public contracts to set the rules about which type of AI or other digital tech we are buying. So we expect procurement and procurers to do this heavy lifting of the norm setting, establishing the playing field, And the hope is that because some of the public buyers are so big, this is going to have a market shaping effect. So basically, the market is going to offer what the public buyer wants, and then that's going to become the standard for everybody. And at the same time, there's a slightly competing claim that is to say, well, public buyers don't need to entirely figure it out by themselves, because what they can do is they can leverage, they can use technical standards that are being developed by the ISO, the IEEE, and other institutions. So we expect procurement to have this effect of norm diffusion, if you want. What this means, if we take a bit of a regulatory lenses, is that we are putting procurement in the position of a regulatory gatekeeper. So the public buyer is the one that decides what technology gets through, which doesn't get through. And I think that the first observation is that this is a bit different from using procurement for other gatekeeping purposes. For example, when in the UK, procurement has been used to enforce minimum wage requirements, that's a pretty clear requirement. Either you pay this wage per hour per employee or you don't. It's easy to set, it's easy to monitor. But now we are in a completely different game. And my claim, and maybe this is one of the provocations, is that it's a very different game for two reasons. The first one is that I am not only worried about what the tech providers are going to do, but I'm worried about what the public sector is going to do with the tech. So we need to use procurement to discipline both the supply and the demand side of this market. And I think this is different. It's a different game. And the second one is that we don't really have lots of pre-existing regulation of the tech. So we need to figure it out as procurers, and we need to invent and reinvent the wheel as we go. You need to, as a procurer, be able to determine very specifically what you're trying to buy, because that's the nature of procurement. But at the same time, we don't have specific technical specifications, metrics. There's lots of uncertainty about how to measure many things that we're trying to do. So I think we are in a bit of a different game, even if it sounds a bit familiar. And can public buyers just go and do it? Can they just figure it out as, and take it in their step? I think it will depend. Will depend, of course, on both structural and per project issues. And I'm very happy to have fellow panelists that come from very sophisticated buyers. But I think when I think about these issues, I worry about the little council in the middle of England trying to buy an AI to manage its payroll. And clearly, that's also a very different game. So I need to think about what barriers may arise from the capability and the institutional positioning of the buyer, and then also about what tools the existing rules allow this buyer to deploy. And of course, we're going to have a spectrum of lots of sophistication to no sophistication at all. My concerns are maybe a bit of a caricature of the less sophisticated buyers. I concede that from the beginning. Digital skills and challenges. I think this cuts across, and this may be a bit of an elephant in the room, because I think we sort of know, but we don't really acknowledge that buying these things is very complicated. It's very complicated to understand the market. It's very complicated to understand how it's going to work, but it's also complicated to design the contract and enforce the contract once you're in the contract. And I think this is not unique to the UK. There's a growing gap in digital capability between the public sector and the private sector, which means that we have public buyers that, however well resourced, they're going to be matched or outgunned by the private tech vendors. And I think this is something that we need to have in the back of our heads from the beginning. Also, that some of the things that the public sector is doing are short-term fixes with big governance problems down the line. For example, bringing in a bunch of consultants or outsourcing lots of the exploration or design phases creates problems of Chinese walls, revolving doors, and so on and so forth. And I think we are increasingly aware of this. Canada, for example, has a very advanced sort of strategic plan to try to boost the digital capability of the public sector. I think something similar exists in New Zealand, but it's difficult because in the end, you need to attract the people, you need to retain them, you need to pay them. So we have problems that are also not new in procurement regulation. And then we have this issue I was alluding to of the institutional embedding of the public buyer. We have some potential problems that we know well. One of the problems is when you're trying to go to OpenAI and say, I want a deployment of your ChatGPT, you are likely to be the smaller party in this negotiation. So we have a potential weak public buyer problem, depending on how we design these procurements. But that's one we sort of know and understand. I think that the bigger governance problem that I have identified in my research is what I call the two-sided gatekeeping. And this is that basically when the procurer needs to think about what does safe, trustworthy, ethical AI deployment in this specific context mean, they need to worry about not what the tech provider may do to cut corners or try to sell something as plug and play that is not going to be such, but also in what the public sector is going to do with it. The public, in the end, the public procurator is in its understanding of gatekeeping, it's the last line of defense before the public sector goes and deploys this AI. So they need to worry about what the use is going to mean. And what that probably does is it puts them in a strange position. And it puts them particularly in a strange position if there are lots of additional pressures on the buyer. So if you have a malfunctioning public sector where the higher above have decided tech is the solution, then you're going to be in a bit of a tricky position as a buyer to say, I cannot actually buy the tech that solves the problem, right? And the same if there are macro political issues, such as, for example, in the UK, that they want to use procurement to boost the development of the British foundational model, the British ChatGPT. That's going to be a problem in those procurements as well, because you could have the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, and you have the industrial policy concern driving everything else. So I think that's a bit of an issue. And it's a bit of an issue, again, depending on how things are organized, because you design the contract to control these two parties, but then they go and play between themselves. And the implementation is going to be between the public sector, a user, and the tech provider. Of course, if the person that designed the contract stays all the way until contract implementation, there is a mitigation. But otherwise, what I think is that there's an opportunity for their interests to align away from the contract. So you could have, for example, designed very well thought through safeguards about explainability, but if in a project meeting they decide something less explainable is more accurate, let's run with it, there's not much we can do at that stage, because procurement is sort of trying to anticipate problems, but it's not there at the time of implementation, again, depending on organizational considerations. So those are what I think are broad governance issues that we're not thinking about much. The ones that are thinking a bit more are the ones that have to do with the tools. So, okay, we have this responsible procurator that's going to design all these things, and do we have the right tools to allow them to regulate the AI they want to buy? I think we have to begin with issues of a limited understanding of the technology, but also the way these things assemble. They can be very complicated. You can be offered something that is just one top layer that builds on top of different layers. And apparently vendors even have difficulty explaining, does your solution have AI? That sometimes they don't know exactly, because there may be some component somewhere that has an element of AI. They don't know because they subcontract it or use it on a cloud or whatever. So we have issues around understanding that. And some of these issues can be used to build exclusivity claims. So we can have lots of vendors saying, well, I am the only one that can offer this functionality. And then unless you're a very well-resourced, knowledgeable buyer, you may fall for it. And then if you fall for it, direct award at the end of procurement. So that's one issue that worries me. Another one that worries me is, what does responsibility mean in this area, right? So what we want to do is, particularly when talking about trustworthy deployments, what does it look like somebody that doesn't behave professionally the way we would want to exclude them? And we don't really know. So for example, if an AI company has participated in the deployment of something that becomes controversial, say the Compass recidivism tool, do we debar them because we think that tool was wrong or not? It's tricky, because there's going to be lots of decisions that are co-generated between the tech company and the user. There's going to be lots of things that they could say, well, we didn't know then yet. So there's lots of issues around, I think, exclusion and qualitative selection, as we would call here, or responsibility in the US, that are still to be figured out. There's also, for me, the bigger problem that some of the attributes we want in this AI are just incommensurable. They're sort of absolutes. What does it mean that something is trustworthy? Or what does it mean that something is fair? There's going to be either two big words that don't mean anything, or lots of difficulties in translating this into metrics, KPIs, and potential sanctions down the line to discipline the behavior of those promising those issues. And I think this links to the ongoing discussion about the difficulty of buying for quality, right? We're still all obsessed with price. Why are we? Because it's so hard to buy for quality. And then this might be more of a EU UK problem, but we don't really like technological prescriptiveness on the buyer. So, okay, you can tell us what you like according to a standard, but you always have to look for equivalence, and you have to accept equivalence. And I think that basically means you cannot regulate, or it's very difficult to regulate, because you need to think about solution A, B, C, D that could allow you to achieve this level of whatever explainability, trustworthiness, or whatever it is. And then there's also the issue of difficulties with enforcing the contract, and especially performance clauses. I think it requires very hefty monitoring, and also it's hard to think about what consequences to impose to make it work. Otherwise some sanctions might become just the cost of doing business, high contract prices that then support some fines. That's the way to go. So all of this basically also combined with what might be a very peculiar obsession of mine, or maybe a European one, which is that public buyers faced with all of this complexity, they will naturally try to look for standards. Is there an industry standard I can rely on so I don't have to invent it? Is there an industry standard I can say, as long as you comply with this standard, it's fine? And the problem is that those standards are being developed in ways that are non-transparent, they're not necessarily participative, and in the EU are raising lots of flags in particular, because in the context of the AI Act, the standards are seen as the main tool to protect, for example, fundamental rights. And go to the ISO and ask them, when was the last time they took fundamental rights into account in developing a standard? Probably this is going to be news to them. And are they going to be able to do it? So I think what to me is weird from the governance perspective is that we started with a question, can we use procurement to regulate, i.e. can we use procurement to set the rules? And then procurement sort of becomes a funnel for the integration of rules that are designed by industry. So somehow the tech industry is setting its own rules of the game, either through direct negotiation or through the standards that they are setting. So to me, this doesn't really work with regulation by contract. It looks a bit like almost set terms for the deals, especially if the tech is very wanted, we will end up taking whatever the companies offer us. So conclusion, like I was saying, I don't think public buyers are great digital gatekeepers, at least not most of them. It could be that some of them, the very sophisticated ones, can deal with some issues, but they are not the institution that we should trust with regulating AI. I think we need a different approach. I think we need an AI regulator, and I think we need an AI regulator that can do mainly 4 things. The first one is I would like the AI regulator to provide external oversight of how the public sector goes about adopting AI and deploying it. I want this regulator not only to have loads of independence and expertise, but also to be the one driving the boosting of digital skills across the public sector. So make it into a center of excellence, a training center if you want. I want this regulator to check those industry-led standards and say, is this standard actually taking the public interest into account sufficiently? If so, it can be certified. If it's not certifiable, then we need to develop another public interest regarding standard. And the last thing, but this is the one that is most, or hopefully it's going to be most provocative, so I'm interested in feedback, is about subjecting every instance of AI used by the public sector to prior permission. And once we know about specific uses, we can start creating sort of block exemption regulations to say, if you're using this software for payroll, that's fine. It's very low risk, so you can go ahead and do it. But as an initial start point, I think every deployment of AI by the public sector should be permissioned. And this would bring this sort of the wait and see approach, give us a bit of a breather that some are advocating for. Probably not a very popular option. So I'm very interested in your feedback. This was quite a big rundown of lots of research behind this. Actually, it's not just what I woke up this morning and thought about. You can check it out in the web page that I have for the project. And then there's a couple more things to come, and apologies for the plug. Of course, this is all going to translate into a book. Hopefully, you will all buy it and read it at some point in 24. And there's also an in-person public lecture at the University of Bristol. So if you happen to be in the island in July, it's the 4th of July. I'm really sorry for the Americans, probably not a great date. And it's not going to be recorded. So, might end up being a bit parochial. But if you're interested and around, please do come in. And more generally, stay in touch. Thanks for your patience while I was presenting, and I really look forward to my colleagues' comments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Albert. That was excellent. And I just want to add one note that I failed to mention at the outset of my welcome remarks, which is that we had over 600 registrants for this webinar from over 81 countries. And so there is clearly global interest in this topic, and you've certainly left us with a lot to think about. I know as the anti-corruption and procurement person, I have some thoughts about the debarment aspect, which you mentioned, and I'd love to get to that. But more importantly, I want to turn to my colleagues who have also joined us today. I'm going to let Aris kick it off for the European perspective, and then we're going to go across the pond to the Americans on the panel. So take it away, Aris.
Thank you. Thank you very much for Jessica for the invitation, and all the other colleagues and the participants from all over the world. That's fantastic. Obviously, it's not surprising. The topic is really hot, and I don't think it will stop being hot for the foreseeable future. So I'm Aris Georgopoulos. I'm based at the University of Nottingham, the Public Procurement Research Group, where I'm leading the Innovation AI Strategic and Defense Procurement Research Unit. Currently, I'm not in the UK. I'm in Italy with some good weather, because also I'm sponsored by the British Academy for an Innovation Fellowship on this subject. So, in response to Albert's thought-provoking propositions, I don't take into account the angle of today's presentation, which is the procurement of AI solutions by the public sector. I think that by and large, I see and I concur with his observations. And that we see that even from not just the UK perspective, but in the EU, there is, in the context of the AI Act, there are discussions about how to better frame the regulation, specifically of these aspects of procuring AI for the public sectors, and for those that they have been involved in one way or another in the discussions. Even the whole process of agreeing on the wording of the provisions brings it's very a great challenge. Now, from the point of view of the institutional aspect, I have some questions, and I see the logic of proposing a regulator. And that would be, I would say, the logical approach and the approach that has been taken in other fields of regulation. My worry is the following. If that's, what would be the role of the regulator? Would it be simply to regulate or act as the gatekeeper in terms of standards of what available technology will be then procured, or would it have a wider role of overseeing and applying and enforcing the wider standards about the inclusion and use of AI in the public sector more generally? I cannot see how the first can be just the very, very specific frame without having the wider discussion about the role that AI plays, because it is there and will play in the medium and long term. And this is why I have been advocating for some time now the need for having not even a discussion, is having this coordinated approach in a similar way that we are doing for global warming at the highest of echelons, where all the governments, regional, the big players, but also the private sector, because as you know, these technological developments, especially in the Western world, have been spearheaded by private initiative, right? So the private sector, be it governments or the development of the technology by private, publicly funded institutions, universities, follows a few years back, right? So I think it's very, very important conversation to be had where everyone needs to be involved. Now, what's the problem? The problem, as I see it, is that although this process started as, well, let's say OpenAI, for example, as open access approach, now we are dealing with, behind the wall proprietary approaches, right? Because there is huge investment. So having or convincing these players, because without them, there is no point. So how can you discuss black boxes issues if the companies that they own, right, access, even to let you look into the abyss, the technological abyss, have rights to protect, and they hide behind their proprietary rights. My question is whether using traditional approaches, be it for institutional regulatory design or simply regulatory design, would be sufficient to deal with those aspects. Of course, if we're looking at the lower bottom ends of artificial intelligence, I think, of course, as we speak, they are being procured, and some of them have some very good results with efficiency gains and what have you. But when we look at AI at the macro level, the potential, I really don't know whether our existing understanding of well, we'll look about that. We'll discuss about that later, about governance more widely. But institutional design and regulatory design is enough to deal with the challenges that this new technology poses. I will leave it here, and obviously we'll have the chance to explore questions later on. Thank you.
Scott?
I can only speak about my experience procuring artificial intelligence. So I'll give it a go. And I want to start with, I didn't just jump into this. So my name is Scott Simpson. I'm the digital transformation lead for the DHS Procurement Innovation Lab. I'm a former contracting officer. I've got over 10 years of contracting, that's buying experience with the government. Before that, I was a graduate of the Washington College of Law. So I've got a law degree. I'm barred in Maryland. What we bought was an artificial intelligence to help our contracting officers when they're both starting market research and when they're trying to evaluate past performance. So think about, you've got market research out there. You want to know what is the best umbrella to buy. Where do you go? There is so much data, you need help. So that's what we were doing for our contracting officers, our acquisition workforce. The same thing for when you go in to start to evaluate the reviews of that umbrella that you're buying. That's the past performance. How did it perform? There's just so much data there. How do you distill that so that if a company who makes umbrellas and raincoats and galoshes and whatever else is bidding on your contract, you just care about the umbrella, you don't care about the rest, and you want that model of umbrella, not the model from last year, the model from next year, just that one. So there's a lot of information to distill. So that, in a nutshell, is what we were buying. And like I said, I didn't just start out thinking, I think I'm going to buy some AI today. We've got a program here in the US for federal employees called the Digital Information Technology Acquisition Program, DITAP. And that results in a certification, a digital services certification. And that walks through a participant in about 6 months. Not everything you need to know, but it gives you a really good insight into what is emerging technology, what is agile, what are all these things that, IT things that you're buying, and then what kind of questions do you need to ask about that. So I went through that program, and then I started buying AI. And I think that there's a lot of things that that both Albert and Aris said that I want to kind of chime in on. The way that we purchased it, Albert mentioned going, right to price. That's not how we did that. We actually never considered price in ours. We used a really special authority called the Commercial Solutions Opening Program, CSOP, the CSOP program. And that allowed us to basically do a bake-off. So we did pilots. So we had 9 companies come in. We gave them each, like $25,000. Really small money, because we're trying to grow a new industry. They each got the same amount. And we said, hey, you've got 4 months. You've got access to all of these acquisition workforce members. Build us a prototype that will sort the most important past performance from the least important past performance. And at the end of those 4 months, they came in and gave us a demonstration. And we kind of scored that demonstration and decided who succeeded and who didn't. Now, it wasn't just like, hey, silence in there either. I'm a real big agile advocate. So we talked to them every month. I talked to them every week, but we had a check-in after the first month. We had a check-in after the second month. We had a check-in after the third month, and then the final. So of those 9, 7 were actually successful. And 6 of them decided they wanted to carry forward. So then we awarded new contracts to those 6. Again, not looking at price. We knew that these 6 were viable. We'd already started to look at them. And so they kept building and going forward. And, eventually we got down to 3 of them that have, fully functioning systems that are ready to implement. 4 that are fully functioning, ready to implement. We're just waiting on a few governance things. And so that's kind of how we bought it. We didn't look at price. We still haven't looked at price. And it's just part of the thing. The other thing that I want to talk a little bit about is, privacy concerns. I think that's a big thing, especially when you're dealing with past performance information. This is, umbrella company X, Y, and Z who's built bad umbrellas. That's not our job as the government to put that information out there. That's sensitive information. We don't want that just released to everybody. And that's just one example of it. There are so many other examples of PII, personally identifiable information, birth dates, socials, whatever else. And it's only going to get more, right? Where we start going to DNA and bios, it's going to get to be more. And so when we were building these, that was one of our key components. Was it's got to be able to be FedRAMP certified. When FedRAMP is one of our authority to operate standards, as well as it's got to have the ability to anonymize, completely anonymize from when it enters the vendor system to when it exits the vendor system. And so that's what we worked on. It was part of the algorithms that they had for anonymization. It turned out that it was really hard to do, but they were definitely able to do it. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about like that fair and trustworthy kind of option that Albert brought up as well, because I think it is achievable. When we're thinking of trustworthiness, I'm a big Harry Potter fan. So it's funny that we're talking to Bristol University today. But Mr. Weasley says to Ginny, don't trust anything that you don't know where its brain is kept. And I feel like AI is kind of the same, right? So if you can't explain how that AI is coming up with that answer, you're not ready to use that yet, or that AI is not ready to be deployed. You need to be able to explain where it's getting its answer from. And I think that's really important, especially for the government, because I'm a public servant. I'm doing things on behalf of the taxpayer, our citizen. If someone asks me, well, why did you make that decision? I need to be able to explain why I took that action. I can't just say, well, the AI told me to. That's not right. That's not in the best interest of the citizen or the safety of our country or anything else. So it needs to be fully explainable. And that was also baked into our requirements when we were putting it together. The last thing is fairness. And that one's a tough one, because there's so many things that we don't see, I think, especially with inherent bias towards one type of company or another type of company. And so if we're looking at market research, a big example of this is the biggest way to show that a company is going to be successful on the next contract is to show that they've had a contract that they were successful on. Well, that is like a negative feedback loop, because you can't get that first contract if you haven't been successful on a contract before. So how do we take into account the emerging entrants, those new vendors that are bringing lots of energy, lots of innovations, all of that? How do you get them into the market research threshold? And that's what we're working on now. We're looking at, well, have they done this work for state and locals? Have they done this work for industry? Have they worked with a university, a college, someone like that, somewhere where they have tested it even just a little bit? And then from there, we've got programs to help them through, like the CSOP program, like our other transactional authorities program, like our 8A program, like our prizes and challenges program. So we got lots of stuff there to try to be fair. But these are things that I think need to be kept in mind as we're putting the contracts together. And again, it's something that If someone was just out there and their program office told them, hey, we want to buy this AI, without the DITAP program, I might not have known to ask those questions, and without having all the experience. So I think a lot of it too is educating and making sure that our acquisition workforce is educated on how to buy, not necessarily on, well, hey, there's this regulation out there, you have to comply with it. We want them to foster a learning culture at the Pill. We really want people to be curious. And so if we can educate them to think about what are all the implications downstream from this, then it's not necessarily just, this is what the FAR says, this is what I have to go with. Thanks.
Wow, that was great. A lot to unpack there. Thanks, Scott. Liz, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. My name is Liz Chirico. I work for the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Procurement. I'm the Acquisition Innovation through Technology lead, and I'm super excited to be with everyone today. I think it's going to be really hard to follow up after everything everybody said, but I just would like to discuss a few things that are relevant within DoD concerning artificial intelligence. So in 2021, the DoD implemented and issued a memo, and there's been several memos and different forms of guidance released concerning artificial intelligence. And so this is specifically called Implementing Responsible AI within DoD. And there's some high-level guidelines, which many of our panelists have discussed already, like it should be responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. And again, I think, all of these things are good. Everyone can agree on them. I think what we really need to think about in relation to all of these responsible AI guidelines, though, is what powers artificial intelligence and machine learning, and it's data. And so I think, there's going to be a lot of, I think there already is, maybe to some extent, there's some power struggles over who owns the data. Where's the data coming from? Is it publicly releasable? Where does it live? Who's maintaining it? Is it, clean? Is it structured? Is it unstructured? And I think those are all really, really important questions to answer before even talking about artificial intelligence powered or machine learning powered technologies or software solutions or anything like that. Because without the data and without understanding how that data is going to be governed and managed and where it's coming from, I think those things, it's driving a lot of second and third order effects. So I would say, especially with regard to artificial intelligence, it's important, as our panelists have mentioned before. And I think it's in the best interest of these companies, whether it's a small business or a large business, to show some kind of traceability of their models. How is the model operating? And I think this is going to be super important moving forward. I don't, like Scott was saying before, it's not just like, oh yeah, trust me, the AI told me this, so it's fine. I think everybody moving forward is going to have to demonstrate to some extent how a model is working, how an AI-powered technology is working. Does that mean that they have to show every single little piece of how every decision is made? No, probably not. Especially with neural networks, I think that gets really, really complicated. And probably the average consumer or public servant, that's going to be really challenging for them to even understand if that's released. But I think, within the government, for instance, I think, NIST standards, they've issued a lot of standards, understanding how artificial intelligence works, understanding, what is sort of auditable, scalable, repeatable, auditable. Those are all really important principles to consider when leveraging AI-powered technologies. I would also like to add, I think there's a lot of opportunity within both the FAR and the DFARs for some changes on how we purchase these technologies. I think intellectual property is super important, particularly for small businesses, for all businesses, but small businesses especially, again, as the panelists have discussed, is, they are going to be very protective of that intellectual property and all the hard work that they put into creating something that they want anyone to use, whether it's the government or private consumer. So we have to think about how the government is leveraging that technology solution. Does the government really require, all of the data rights? And also, if we do require them, what are we doing with them? Like, who's monitoring that? And I think that's the other piece of it. So I think there's the upfront part that the government has to be really, really wise and cautious about. What are we buying? What's the data that's powering this model? And then on the back end of it, it's a lot of like, how is the model going to continue to be updated and trained? Who's in charge of doing that? Again, where's the data coming from? Because I think if you're purchasing like a large language model, which a lot of AI or ML is powered by, you can't just buy, it's not a static model, or it shouldn't be. It's going to continue to change and evolve as it should, as the data changes, as the customer or the end user, the needs of the end user maybe change. So what maybe the solution that you wanted today is not going to be the same as what you need next year or a few years down the road. So I think it's really important to think about data governance in light of that and how those models are going to be maintained and trained, both on the contractor or private business side and also on the government side. And this gets to other points, again, the panelists have made previously is, education of our workforce. Do we have data stewards that are ready to monitor models and check large language models that are delivered to us? Are we maintaining them? We just paid all this money for this fantastic large language model as a service that's helping power all these amazing decision-making aspects of our job. And now, we don't have anyone to maintain it. And it's sitting there and it's going to get obsolescent over time. So I think that's a big issue to think about as well. I think there's some flexibility within the regulations right now, but I think we could use more. And I think there are policy changes and regulation changes that definitely will come into effect. And I think finally, another thing, again, to consider with this is just the amount of computing resources required to power AI and ML solutions. Right now, it's taking an enormous amount of computing resources, and that all drives a lot of cost. And so I think that's just another thing that both the government needs to think about and those who are working with the government. And as public servants, again, as Scott mentioned, like it's our responsibility to think strategically about that before, diving into something that, again, maybe provides short-term gains, but we need to think of the long-term ramifications as well.
Thanks, Liz. Also fantastic. Everything was great. We have questions coming in, and I encourage everyone that's joined us to please feel free to add your questions. Some of them we will answer live in the last 20 plus minutes or so, and some we will be answering in real time and typing them out. So please use Q&A. Albert, this is your gig. Do you want to respond to anything that's been said so far?
Well, I guess that the first thing to say is that it's great to see such committed and knowledgeable public buyers, because it's not everyone that just says, well, I first try to understand what I'm buying and then I go to buy it. I think we are all really on the same page. I guess that the big question that is floating there is how much we should put all of those things in statute, right? So what to address a bit of Aris's concern about, you cannot just look at, you permission it and then you don't look at it anymore. You have to look at the whole context. So for example, when I talk about the regulator in my draft chapter, what I say is, well, the regulator should allow you to deploy or not deploy based on the case that you make. And in the case, it should be how resourced you are, but how resourced are you going to be through the life cycle of this, to also avoid what Liz was saying. It's like, well, we buy this shiny thing, but then we cannot maintain it. We don't know what to do. Then we need to outsource those contracts as well. And it creates a bit of a snowball of outsourcing. So what the regulator would basically look at, the buyer and say, do you have a SCOT or do you have a lease? Are they going to be sustainably with you? Do they have the capacity to deal with this? If not, you're just not buying it, right? So it's a bit like when you need to tell your children, it's like, this toy is for 12-year-olds, you're 3, you're not getting it, you're going to break it. And it's a bit of a simplification, but I think we need this from the outside, because I think it's very hard for organizations to be so self-aware and responsible in a sustained manner. There's lots of issues of political capture, industry capture. There's issues of resource constraints. All of a sudden, they come and chop a program, and then what happens with that one? And maybe the only other reaction I would have is that I think it changes when we're talking about citizen-facing services. So far, most of what we're discussing is a bit of enterprise-facing procurement environment where of course there are lots of challenges, but when you're talking about citizens, then it's the thing that worries me is that once you implement an AI, you have mass effects. So that's something that hasn't come up yet in the discussion, right? But all of the bad examples about the Netherlands implementing an AI to screen for fraud in benefit claims and identifying basically all foreigners as potential fraudsters just because the data was corrupted, right? And we had this inherent bias. That's what really worries me. And I think that's why the European approach, for all its faults, of establishing different tiers of risk and saying there are some tiers of risk that we're going to look at very, very closely, and we're going to look at basically permissioning them or even prohibiting some deployments of AI. Whereas for back office payment of invoices, what happens is that you miss a payment and you can do it the next day. Well, then the risk is different, right? So I think things are sufficiently complicated that we need to contextualize it quite a lot. And I think that everything that has been said just basically leads me to the question of why not make it mandatory? Why not say, if you want to buy the AI, these are the requirements it has to comply with. These are your organizational requirements. You need to make the case and you need to be approved. Otherwise, it just doesn't go forward. I guess I don't see a strong downside to doing that. But for, of course, people saying, oh, it's going to take a long time. It's going to be costly. You're going to stifle innovation. But there's innovation that you need to control, right? We don't allow people to just go and sell medicine on the hope that it's going to be innovative. We don't allow anyone to have a nuclear reactor in their backyard, right? So I think in some of the cases, we're dealing with similar things. And then maybe just don't buy it. And if you don't understand it or you're not able to manage it. But I don't know, I think people are quite uncomfortable usually when you say the public sector should ask for permission to do stuff to an independent regulator or another bit of the public sector. I don't know what's the core of the resistance, but there is a resistance.
The one thing that I think that really struck me is this education component, which I think you're talking about not knowing how to use it. And Scott mentioned the fact that he thinks there needs to be better training and education, because I think a lot of the tools that you're mentioning that you've taken advantage of, I don't think there's widespread understanding of the ability to access some of these tools. And I mean, look, I'll tell you, I see Scott's name everywhere, and I know you've got like 50 different avenues of trying to educate people on what you're doing, which I applaud. But I guess part of the question I have is the education component. And could it be replicated in other countries trying to do it, but not even, I mean, the United States, which just seems to be moving forward. I mean, what could we do from a United States perspective? And I'd also be interested in an education perspective from the EU to help better educate the acquisition professionals. I don't know, Scott, do you want to take this on the US side?
First, you got to educate me on how to get off mute. We've only been doing this for 3 years. I still get stuck. We're kind of taking an incremental approach. The DITAP program was only stood up maybe 4 years ago. And so right now we're saying, okay, if you're going to buy IT that's over a certain value, and I think it's $1 million, then you have to have this DITAP certification. Otherwise, you can't buy IT. And so that's what we're starting with. And I think what you'll see, though, is that as IT begins to touch more and more things, the DITAP program is going to grow. Because you think about now, like, I want a study done. I want to study where the people are coming from that enter the United States. Well, hey, I've got an AI that can do that, but you're not buying IT, you're buying a study, right? And so that the two are going to come together. And I think it's just a matter of expanding the program. And then, like you mentioned, education, no two people learn the same way, right? Adults learn by doing, just like children really learn by doing too, touching, feeling. This is a good way to kind of spur ideas. but you need to learn by doing. So you need that practical on-the-job training. You need something that's accessible. I'm a big fan of putting like our Pillcasts on LinkedIn because it's right there. You can watch it in whatever browser you're kind of thumbing through. Even if you're, sitting in front of the television after work, you can get 5 minutes of training done. And I've just educated you about something. So it's about getting to people, not getting people to come to you. That's how I think of education. And especially with these kind of complex topics, you're not going to get someone to come and sit through an 8-hour lecture on AI. Hopefully, we saw here, we've got 600 people from 81 countries, so we can get them to come to a 90-minute lecture on AI. But how do you get out to them so that you can keep educating and get these ideas out to them? The other thing that I want to talk to is that, Albert has all these great questions. And one of the things that we did, and I think it's a best practice, I don't know if it has to be formalized or not, but I would love for it to be a best practice, is we had a panel. So when the 9 vendors were presenting their prototypes, we had a panel of people. We had someone from our Chief Technology Officer. We had someone from our Office of Chief Information Officer. We had a PhD with the Arizona State University who is working on artificial intelligence. And then we had 2 people from the procurement side. And all we did was ask questions of that prototype, the what ifs. How is this going to control for bias? How is this going to control for that? So I think that's really a best practice too. And in that kind of sense, it's kind of a different type of procurement. You can't just look at it on paper and say, okay, I'm good to go. I think that panel is a really good best practice to have to get down into those deep questions.
Aris, you want to take from the European perspective? You're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Yes. So from the EU's perspective, I think obviously because the EU, when it needs to move in a regulatory sense, it takes more time. You have to coordinate between various stakeholders. We are in the process with the AI Act and a series of other regulatory instruments in the Digital Markets Act, which they have a significant AI-related component, or they will create implication and spin-off that affect AI regulation. The process at the moment is, it's stuck between the identification of the various parameters or if you want, the KPIs that the regulatory instruments need to fulfill. And of course, that is more difficult when you have 27 member states, governments to agree. You have also the European Parliament, which is also part of the process. Then you have a completely different, if you want, combination of preferences. At the moment, the AI Act is on the way to being enacted. But as I said before, fundamentally, when it comes down to using procurement or purchasing AI solutions by the public sector, so far we have to go back and rely on the what I could call the analog regulatory system of the directives. I try to make sense of that. So the proposals or the approach that Scott put forward, I think, makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking whether it could be facilitated within the existing framework of the regulatory frameworks of the directives. We have what we call, and probably this for the first time that it might be useful, the innovation partnership procedure, which is a procedure that it has own data. The reason of its existence is to provide that pathway of flexibility to allow the public sector to interact with the private sector in ways that they go beyond the traditional, let's say, competition model on which the rest of the directive lies upon. So in that sense, some of the ideas that Scott mentioned, and of course Liz's input, could provide this sort of best practices, points of reference where they could be facilitated, I think, if or in cases where European public procurement authorities would like to pursue that avenue, because they are efficiencies that can be attained.
Thanks, Aris. So I often speak to groups about the use of AI to reduce risk and promote integrity in the procurement process, and it's a much more narrow piece of this issue. And one of the things that I cite frequently is both Scott and Elizabeth's and Liz's work in this area, particularly the one that Scott was describing about the use of AI, where I often refer to generally as like emerging tech. That's kind of my umbrella term to enhance the past performance process within DHS. And what I loved about it is the example that I've seen and the way it's been described online is that prior to this, there would be so many evaluations per procurement that you couldn't have a human being sift through it. So you'd basically ask the industry to pick its 3 relevant past performance evaluations to consider. And of course, industry's cherry picking the best ones for your procurement, so that by using these tools and made the process more efficient, more effective, and gave you a better understanding of past performance. And similarly with Liz's use in DoD for responsibility determinations, or what we often refer to as pre-qualification in a more global sense, it streamlined that process significantly. And all of these things have made processes that are critical in the procurement process more efficient and frankly, more effective and reduced in my opinion, reduced risk. Yet some of the questions that I'm seeing raised in the Q&A, which keep them coming, we love them, and also in Albert's presentation, there's a concern, there's a fear about where the technology can go wrong. And frankly, some of it just sounds to me like things that human error could easily do as well. But there seems to be a greater fear about the reliability. And when I do these presentations, I'm always, well, how do we check this? How is this reliable? How do we know that it's working? And so I want to open it up, and I don't know who wants to take this, and it's probably the least efficient way to do this on Zoom. You can all come off at once and just make a loud noise. But who would like to respond to this kind of, I wouldn't want to call it an overwhelming sense of fear, but there is a fear of these tools and the reliability and accuracy to do some of these things we've long used humans to do manually.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Well, I'll jump in quickly and then allow the other panelists to jump in as well. I think, so you're making a really good point about, AI and ML providing access to data that humans had access to previously, but it was just too unwieldy or just too much data to really deal with. Like going through thousands of pages long of 10 years of contract documents or something like that, all the way down to a CLIN level, all the way down to every single policy and regulation, hundreds of pages long, each contract action. A human could go through all of that, but how reliable would that be? I mean, somebody would just be tired of reading through that, very quickly. But I think that there's a balance between harnessing the technology that we have to access all of those data points and help to inform us and help us to make better decisions and really empower our workforce. And I think the good thing about a lot of the technologies is that you can build in the capability to audit every single step that technology is doing. So it shouldn't be, nothing will come out as a surprise necessarily. Like you're going to have you'll have logs of every single action that, whether it's a robotic process automation tool or some other kinds of tool. AI is a little more complicated because I think, especially with neural networks, there's more steps that are being taken in between, an input and an output. But I think a lot of the tools, we have the power to bake in that auditability. And I think it's a really exciting time to access and really harness the power of data that previously was just too unwieldy to really truly access and help provide insight to us. So I think it's exciting, but I do think it's a balance.
Hey, Jessica, there's a great question in the chat about that. But how would the user or public safeguard against inaccurate or malicious disinformation, especially around data? And could an independent regulator overlook negative outcomes caused by this, even where a well-savvy trained user misses?
Do you want to address that?
Oh no, Liz was talking about data, so I thought she should address the data question.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Scott. Well, that's a great point. Yes, I think there's a lot of data challenges, right? Whether it's our own data that we've had for years, but maybe it's inaccurate or there's issues with it. We need to clean it. We need to structure it. We need to extract it in, more accurate ways. But I think the good news there is that technology can help us with that. And the other piece of that, I would say, is that, there's a such thing as human in the loop for all of this, which just means that a human is involved in every single step of a technology process involving artificial intelligence and machine learning. And there's like human assisted machine learning too, where you're building something or you're watching something or you're helping to train a model and help it to understand what data is it looking at, what is it reading, what is it extracting. I think, yes, there can be a concern for malicious data, absolutely, but that's where I think you have to be really careful about your data sources. Where is the data coming from? Also, I'd be curious to hear, between Europe and the US, the GDPR, privacy data. I think privacy is that's going to be a massive issue. It already is, but it's going to be even more of an issue moving forward. And so I think taking all those things into consideration is super important. On the other side, I think there's a lot of opportunities with this. So, for private data, PII data, there's a way to create synthetic data that mirrors maybe something that would be proprietary or private or PII data. And you can use that synthetic data based on, say it's pricing data. You could put in, numbers, labor categories, rates, et cetera, that aren't necessarily real, but you're just plugging information in and training the model based on that synthetic data. So nobody's actual real data is being exposed. Their proprietary data or rates or anything else are not being exposed, but you're still training a model to be able to read what that data would look like. And so then when it's processing real data, it's still operating effectively, but you haven't compromised any actual, procurement sensitive data in the creation of that model. That's just like one example.
I think actually one of the biggest problems to with data is that we just have so much data and we don't know what we have even. DHS has data and DOD has data and NASA has data and everyone's got all this data, and most often it's siloed within that agency. And so there's some cross collaboration, but not a whole lot. And even within DHS, like USCIS and CBP and FEMA, they're all talking, but they're not necessarily in their own silos. And so getting access to all of that data, and so that AI can make the most informed decision or help us make the most informed decision, I think that's going to be super important as well in the future, is linking that data so that you can see that and see, oh, hey, like DOD just did this procurement. I don't need to recreate the wheel. It went successful. I can just go over there and do it again or whatever else. And so I think as the AI comes on board, we need to start thinking about that too, and thinking about what data we have, where is it stored, and how can we access and share it, with each other.
But yeah, I think, look, lots of that makes a lot of sense, but I would go back to the issue of the fear and why is the fear of the machine worse than the fear of the tired or disinformed public official making a decision that day. And I think that's what Koyanes and Lai write in that book, in that chapter I put in the chat. So basically they say, well, we'll have to choose for a specific use case. Is it better to use a human or an AI, depending on the accuracy of the AI, the data that we have to feed the AI, and so on. But I think that there are additional concerns. So we all assume, for example, that the human in the loop is a good safeguard. But there's research emerging already saying that humans in the loop are either ineffective, so that they just have algorithmic complacency, they just rubber stamp what the machine said because they trust the machine, or when they go against the machine is because the machine made a decision that doesn't align with their own biases, right? So if the machine says, oh, this person you don't like is actually the best candidate for the job, it's like, nah, AI is wrong. And there's evidence of that. So I think there's also a process of learning about how these things, one, deployed, operate, and the human AI interactions. And these are all things that are very difficult to anticipate. And for me, the fear is mainly about irreversibility. So look at this set of responsibility determinations, right? So you guys know how this was done before the AI, how it's done now with the AI. You'll be around for a while. In 30 years, nobody will know how it was done. They will just know you click this button. If it's green, cool. If it's yellow, if it's red, bad. But why? I don't know. So it creates operational dependency. And I think what is very difficult is to convince organizations to create a redundancy. Say, well, you still need to keep the person that knows how to do it by hand, so to speak, in case the AI goes wrong or in case the AI needs to change or whatever happens. So I think that that's one of the things that worries me. The other thing is that it comes with lots of other governance risks, right? So I'm sure you guys have done loads of cybersecurity checks and all sorts of other governance issues about how to keep that data protected, how to keep the decision protected, how to keep the system working properly. And what that means is that for some organizations, it creates a dependency on the one person or the two people that know how to do this. So the IT cloud person is on holiday, we have a problem. Nobody knows what happens if the cloud is down. So you need to create governance and redundancies in those areas, because otherwise you're over leveraged on a very thin layer of technical knowledge that the institution has. So it changes your workforce. And it's very hard to keep people that know how to do, well, it's probably impossible to keep people that know how to do everything. And the final one is, I think it's fair enough for a human to make a mistake, because usually humans don't make mass decisions, right? So I have a case, I need to award this contract. If I get it wrong, it's going to get challenged. There's going to be a big protest, but it's a one-to-one or one-to-a-few relationship. But when you deploy the AI in some settings, say public pensions, the algorithms goes wrong, you all of a sudden have 100,000 cases of people that were not paid the pension correctly this month. If they all go to challenge it through the regular course, they just swamp the courts or the review mechanisms that you have. So sometimes the fear has to do with what is the redress looking like. The redress against a human is usually at human scale. The redress against a wrong AI decision sometimes is very difficult to figure out. And again, my worry is more about AI deployed touching the citizens rather than AI deployed in more commercial context or back office context as procurement could be. So maybe we are just bringing the fear from that area more into other areas where it's safer if you want, or it's more secure, or it's lower stakes.
Very quickly, Jessica, if I may follow these up. 2 points. First of all, regarding Liz's very correct observation, as we speak, the US-EU Trade and Technological Council is meeting in Sweden under the auspices of the Swedish presidency. And although I don't know the agenda, I would be surprised if the discussion that we are having will not come up, especially after the G7 identification of, we need to figure out what to do with this. That's number one. The other point, and I would like to echo what everyone said before, is the counterfactual, because we put, I think, the AI at a higher, possibly level of scrutiny than the analog system that we are living in, right? Where there is bias, where there is lack of accountability quite often. I mean, look at the PPE, various, fiascos, or were they? Because of course, again, we look at them in hindsight, now that everything is back to normality, but we are not in the position and the shoes of the person that took the analog decision at that time, right? Where everything was at stake. And of course, it led to, unusable PPEs, but you see what I mean? So accountability, even under the current system, is suboptimal, and it changes depending on perspective. So with that in mind, I think it is absolutely important to try to reach a point where the person that presses the button can know more or less technologically what that involves. But of course, we cannot expect that for every single public purchaser with the with the pay grade, their pay grades to do that. Perhaps in large organizations, central governments, that can be afforded, but a local municipality in village X somewhere up on the mountain, I would be highly surprised if at any point in time they would be in a position to do that. So these are the parameters which I'm looking at the moment, and I think that's the crux of the matter for the discussion in order to have a meaningful outcome.
So I think we've got a lot of great questions that have come in. One, I'm going to try to combine a few things. So I'm going to try to be efficient. And if you have more questions, keep them coming. We've got about 20 minutes to go through some of these. So there was the first question I'm going to combine with the second one, which kind of dealt with, at least from the US perspective, whether we think that there's going to be something coming out of the FAR Council anytime soon that will address this. I would say anytime soon is not usually something, no disrespect to the FAR Council, but not a fast process. So I wouldn't say today or next week, although Scott's looking at his head, so maybe he knows something's coming down the pipeline next week. But it's a lengthy process. So I would expect that they are going to do something, but it's going to take a while. We also have questions regarding the fact that because it does take a while, sometimes we seem to get started and by that point it's old IT. So, and even a proposal that maybe we just dedicate an entire agency to IT. So I don't know if we want our US folks, Liz or Scott, to go after how are we dealing with the amount of time it takes to create policy? When can we expect it, et cetera, et cetera. And Scott, I think you guys still have a FAR case open, right?
Yeah, we do have an open FAR case. It has nothing to do with AI, actually. It's all about how we treat past performance under FAR Section 42. But yeah, we've been working on that for a while now and making progress. But that goes back to a little bit of the privacy concern and how we treat company data after it's submitted to the government or is created by the government. What do we do with this data that's created by them for past, in this case, past performance data? But I think it's a really good point about the speed with which we move. And it's something that I think we can do a better job on. There's, that's one of the things I was thinking about while Albert was talking about. Putting all regulations in place take time. And I have the same fear that I think Kelly does about, hey, it's going to take a long time. And by the time everything's implemented, they're obsolete. And it's the same problem we have when we're deploying systems. And I think that's why an agile approach is really a best practice, so that you're deploying constantly, right? You're not waiting until you've got that end product to deploy everything at once 5 years down the line. You're deploying version 1, you're deploying version 2, you're deploying version 3. And at every stage, the user is getting something tangible, something useful. And so the question I have, maybe it's to Albert, to Aris, how do you do that with regulation or with AI so that it stays up to date? Because I do think that the agile technology, the agile framework is too often stovepiped into IT. But like on our team, we don't deal with IT, but we use the agile methodology on a day-to-day basis. Because it's a best practice for managing life. And so that was my biggest takeaway from the DITAP program, was just applying agile to as much as I could. And so how do we apply that to regulating AI? Because, hey, by the time I'm done speaking the sentence, the AI is like moved on.
Yeah, I guess my answer would be you need to do agile well, right? So you can do agile badly. And I think that what the UK government is showing now is, for example, an example of agile done wrongly. So in the end of March, they published this white paper on the AI regulation, and they said, oh, we're going to take a pro-innovation approach, which means we're going to do nothing, but we're going to keep this under review because we want to be agile. So if things change, then we will start doing things. That doesn't sound very agile to me. That's sort of doing nothing and then hoping for the best. I think that the difficulty with agile is that it's a bit different in IT than it is in other places, because the process that you have to go through, I think it's relatively more visible, relatively. I think so. You go to minimum value concept, and then you go to pilot, and then
I disagree there though, because like for your book, right? You started with an outline.
True.
That's your MVP, right? Or that's your framework, you know, your mock-up. And then you didn't go and just write the whole book before anyone looked at it. You had them look at it chapter by chapter by chapter. That you followed the agile approach to write your book. And so that's what I mean by taking the agile approach and putting it forward into other things.
Yeah, but I think that there's a difference between iteration and not having an initial setup, right? That is a good starting point. And I think that from the regulatory perspective, say, if we created this office for the AI in the public sector that I dream of somehow, and that is in place, then what we could say is, well, they need to keep the guidelines under constant review. So, and have an open channel where industry can raise issues, say, hey, version 3.5.2 of this doesn't deal with that. Can you deal with it? And be very responsive. So be responsive in regulation that way.
That to me goes back to having a sprint zero and planning. You need to have the discovery sessions with your users to find out what is their pain point before you start answering their question, because otherwise you're going to go through all these iterations. You're going to do a great job and find out, oh, actually, no one's interested in reading this anymore because people don't like Western novels. You need to be answering the right question. And that to me is the sprint zero, the planning, the discovery, all of that. That you're right, is very different.
Yeah, I would just like to jump in quickly and with relation to the policy, I think, you know, it's going to take a while for policy to catch up, is what I'll say. And I don't know if we have the time to really wait for that. I think we have to, I mean, we don't have the luxury of waiting for it. Let me say that. I think it needs to be happening in parallel, you know, the policy changes and development, but policy, in my experience, has never moved particularly quickly. And I think there's a reason for that, because there is a lot of feedback and time taken and research. And, you know, we have a process that we have to follow, right? But in the meantime, I do think that, you know, we can help ourselves with how showing the auditability and traceability and data governance models and large language model, you know, maintenance. I think we can help ourselves by doing the best we can with the principles that have been put into place and the policies that have been issued, while the federal acquisition regulation and defense federal acquisition regulation policies and regulations catch up to that in the meantime. But I don't think it's just like, well, we can just go wild and free in the meantime and then just cross our fingers for that audit later and hope everything goes well. I mean, I think we have to move responsibly, but I don't think that we can just afford to sit still, because I think this technology is here and it's already moving forward. And I think we are in the middle of a paradigm shift right now. If you think of, there's a lot of analogies, but the first one that came into my mind was like the difference between when you're traveling somewhere and using a paper map to get there. That wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things. And now to say to someone, oh, just get your map out and just chart out your directions and turn here and turn there. I mean, somebody born in the last, 20 years would be like, I don't understand. What are you saying? I just turn on the GPS and it tells me everything. It tells me the traffic. It tells me the best routes to take. It tells me how to avoid tolls. It tells me where there's speed cameras, everything now. And I think even, 30 years ago, we couldn't even conceive of that. And now it's just so baked into our lives. We just take it for granted. And I think that is really similar to kind of the paradigm change that we're moving into with AI. And it is very different, but I don't think it's going to go away. So I think we just have to figure out how we are going to work with it and put safeguards in where we can. But I don't think that we can afford really to wait, because I think it's already here.
Very, very quickly from the EU's perspective, I mean, in the context of catching up with technology, I think the GDPR is a very good example. We had a regulatory framework that was adopted in the early 90s, and in a world where there was no Google, right, or the associated services. And so everything was mapped in that frame, in that box. What technology looks like in 1994, right? we have the internet, hey, and that's the frame. Then you have Google coming in, and then you realize that we need to change the shape and the regulatory framework. Now, it is inevitable that no matter, I'm not saying that it's an exercise in vain, but we have to engage in that process, knowing that things, especially AI, AI technology develops, we develop it by the second, right? So even if we were to adopt a frame now, which was perfect, it would capture everything. 10 minutes afterwards probably wouldn't be sufficient, 100% capturing the whole thing. So that's, we have to deal with that, it's the reality. And that's, I think, where the value of what Albert said is, and Scott said, this sort of establishing some sort of framework of knowing, of constant updating. And I think this is the feedback also that Liz referred to, which is really, really important from stakeholders. I'm wondering whether that type of conversation and feedback, whether it is sufficient to be held at national level. And this is what I was referring to about this AI, AGI, Bretton Woods type of thing, which, by the way, I think in the last an hour and a half, we haven't mentioned the word China. And how, if we regulate and put brakes in how AI develops here and other parts of the world, which in some areas, technological areas, I think could be arguably ahead of the rest of the world. What if the development follows without, with lower standards? It's, for me, it is that type of conversation we need to have and establish the pathways and the bridges to at agency level, but also at government level and with the industry to, agree on a common identifiable ethical standards modus operandi, because otherwise, things might go pear-shaped.
I can just be a bit of contrarian. I think we are maybe falling a bit into the tech inevitability. So the tech is here, it's going to stay here, might as well run with it. I think we need to be a bit careful with that. I think that the precautionary approach is sort of a bit of a dirty word in these days, particularly in AI. It's precaution sounds like stifling innovation, but I think we need to take precaution in many things because we don't understand the implications, and it's going to be very, very difficult to reverse. Maybe it's a very academic-led discussion, but I think there's a movement to say we need to actually wait and see, because we don't have the luxury of moving fast and breaking things we don't know how to mend. So we need to be very careful. And again, it's very context dependent, right? So if we were discussing about buying, completely self-directed drones, that's a different discussion. That if we're talking about, let's do a responsibility determination that basically saves us so many person hours in doing it, right? So it's, again, there's the issues of scale, there's issues, but what I find problematic is the understanding of saying, well, this is here, so let's just run with it. As a starting regulatory point, which is very much the UK position. We haven't done it in many other technologies that are much less complicated, but that have similar effects, say genetical manipulation, again, a US-European divide around those things, or drugs, right? So there's lots of value to say, before you can deploy, you need to test this very seriously, which is something that has emerged from both Scott's and Liz's accounts of how things were done in their organizations. Well, let's put it there. Let's think about what testing needs to take place and demand that everything completes the testing, else they don't deploy, right? Because the problem is that there will always be an organization somewhere that is not so careful. And the other reaction I had to Aris's point about the global issue, I'll try to find the link, but there is a post for the Carnegie Foundation a few days ago that says that the Chinese AI guidelines use the same words that we use in Europe, for example, ethical, trustworthy, but there's a very different political agenda behind the use of the same words. So I wonder if it's actually possible to have a global standard that means the same thing in all the different places with all of our different contexts, but maybe this is for the next part of this webinar or something like this.
All right, we are at our 5 minutes remaining. So, and there's a lot of great questions. So I'm gonna just pick two that I'm going to smush together, and it goes with something that Albert mentioned in his presentation, and that deals with the issue of capture. And And I'll combine a few questions, which was that there were some concerns raised about whether or not if you get selected for this, that it gives you too much clout. There's also concern about the government becoming overly reliant on particular vendors and that they get maybe locked in. Also concern about the ability to attract new talent. And I know that was addressed a little bit in some of the conversations. So maybe, I don't know who wants to take that issue that could kind of address the issue of what kind of lock-in and capture. Albert? Yes.
Yeah, I guess it's about doing your diligence when you start, right? So when you think about this, it's not only about what tech you're going to buy, but how is it going to interact with your own system? So what sort of technical debt you can accrue by buying this or that thing, how to avoid lock-in. There's a lot of discussion about open source. In the EU, there's a very strong push to try to push for open source, but there's also now research emerging saying open sourcing some things is actually problematic, because if you have everything open source, say on deep fakes, then it's very easy for somebody that wants to use the deep fakes to know how to do it and to manipulate them. So I think these are complicated issues, but what would require is to have very clear processes about how do you go about assessing all of these things, and competent people doing these assessments, and to me, independence from industry. Because what you want is somebody to take a hard look about what industry is promising. I really like the idea of having a panel, maybe of completely outsiders that have no real skin in the game. They just want to make sure things are happening in a technical way that is accurate. So I think we need to build as many safeguards as we can, but we will not always get it right. And lock-in in particular is a very tricky one, because it's not only the tech, but it's also the data lock-in, what Liz was referring to. It's if all of a sudden the data that comes out of this is the propriety of the supplier, you're in the hands forever. And I'm looking at you, university travel systems in the UK, because that's what's happening here.
Anyone else don't know? Okay, we have no one's running to jump in on that one. So I'm gonna go with the Chat GPT issue. Whether not only just the use, whether this is a tool that we see that could be used, generative AI could be used in procurements, but also concerns about the unregulated use of open AI tools, which horrifies and terrifies most people. Liz, are you able to do this one or no?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, I think it brings up, the use of Chat GPT and other open AI generators, GPT-4, Bard, things like that. I think there's a danger in using those, particularly with procurement sensitive or privacy related data, because every time you type in a prompt and ask it a question, that puts it all right back out into the world for everyone to see, right? And I think there's been several cases of this. A colleague of mine forwarded an article to me about Samsung engineers, not to pick on Samsung, but they were typing in a problem with their code into ChatGPT to get answers about how to deal with this issue. All of a sudden, their proprietary code is all over the internet. It was a huge problem. Samsung had to shut down, the access to ChatGPT. And that's where I think I was mentioning this previously, but so all that ChatGPT is, I'm not trying to reduce, it's massive, right? It's billions and billions of data points. Google, in their partnership with OpenAI, all these big tech, Microsoft, these tech giants have invested billions of dollars in this technology and training these models. But I think there's an opportunity to train large, because all it is a large language model, right? That you're training to provide back in a question and answer format back to a user what they're asking for. So I saw the question on statements of work, other aspects of contract documents. If you train a large language model and segment it off from, the internet at large, right? And allow a user to type in, generate me a statement of work for IT services. And the model is trained on previous IT services statements of work that perhaps your agency or workforce has used for over 10 years or something like that. And you have, you or a team of human users, right, has certified that this is good training data for this model to learn from. And it can provide, good statements of work to go from. That is an example of how you can leverage a large language model not have all of your data put back out on the internet for everyone to see. But I think, I mean, that brings with it a host of other issues. Absolutely. It takes a lot of time. It brings up the question of good data, good training data, and the amount of time to do something like that. But I think large language models as a service is where we are moving. And I think there's a lot of power in that. But I think we have to be really careful about using, you know, open chat GPT models, because you have to remember everything you put into that model is going to go right back out onto the open internet.
Unless anybody had a quick thought. Albert, did you want to? Nope. Okay. Albert would ban it. So there was an exclamation point when he passed that along to me. So with emphasis, ban from Albert. We are at the 10:30 mark. So, and I'm sorry that we did not get to everybody's questions, but I'm delighted to see how much interest there was in this topic and how enthusiastic and engaging our listeners were today. So a big thank you to our panelists who've joined us today for this lively discussion. An exceptional thank you to Albert for taking the time to present his research in so many different usable formats that people can use for the PowerPoint and whatever, not whatever, but PowerPoints and blogs, you know what I meant. It's early. I will say that we're going to make a recording of this available, and in the email that will go out with a link to the recording, Zoom automatically shoots them out to you, whether or not you've attended. We will also include some of the links that were mentioned during today's discussion, particularly Albert's summary of some of his research to date. This has been so much fun. I'm sure more to come from GW Law in Bristol on this topic. Again, thanks to everybody, and I hope everyone has a great day and a great week.
You too. Thank you,
Thanks,
Jessica.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.